Okay, so now what? I'm going to show you. All right, so yesterday we ran through all of the steps necessary to do a basic compression test. Now, this is important to say at this point. I mentioned a leak down test in that video, and a lot of guys in the comments were, well, you should do a leak down test on it. You'll have a much better representation of what's going on inside the engine. And I agree completely. But here's something you got to keep in mind. When we do videos like this, they're geared to the real novice, the guy who's just learning, the guy who's just cutting his teeth on this stuff, and he's working with a minimum of tools, a minimum of experience, a minimum of everything, just trying to work his way through this type of issue. So that's why we do this type of video the way that we do. And we do it the way a guy at home can, or at least should do it. So that out of the way, let's talk about what we found. Well, let's talk about how we got to this point. So to recap, we picked this thing up a few months ago, got the engine running, found out it was running on 4 cylinders. We grounded each cylinder, we grounded the spark plug wire of each cylinder, and found out number 3 and number 4 were dead. So that tells us pretty much it's going to be a bad head gasket, a break between the 2 cylinders. Each cylinder was getting fuel, each cylinder was getting spark, just no fire, no oomph. Okay, they were just dead players. So yesterday, we went and we did a basic compression test on it just to confirm all of this. We found that cylinders number 3 and 4 had only 30 pounds of compression each. So, okay, no question, this is it. We're gonna pop the head off of it. So last night, that's what we did. We popped the head off of it, and just as we suspected, there's our brake. So now, this is important. Before you start actually digging through things, some basics you really need to grasp, okay? The first step, when you're taking the thing apart, you need to take the engine apart. You need to pay attention to everything. One of the important things, especially when you're dealing with a head gasket issue, is the tightness of the head bolts, taking them off. Now, right away, a lot of people just grab the impact gun and burp, 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 burp. Don't do that, right? This isn't a competition. This isn't a speed competition. This is a work through the engine and try to get as much information as you're taking it apart. Now, the reason why you want to undo them by hand is because if the engine had been severely overheated, those bolts would be loose, or there would be different tightnesses. So you'd find that some of them are torqued, right, and some of them are going to be really loose, some are going to be extra tight. You want to take note of that as you're taking the engine apart. So when we pulled this one apart, each of the head bolts felt about normal. They all broke at about the same, approximately the same amount of effort. I didn't put a torque wrench on them, it's not necessary. You can feel when you've got a loose one, you can feel when you've got a tight one. So pulled the head bolts off of it, everything seemed okay. So now the next step is the head gasket, pulling the head off. So you take the head off. But in the process of taking the head off, you want to try to do as little damage to the head gasket as possible. You want to be able to read all of your parts. Same way you're going to read the head bolts, you want to read the head gasket. And we learned some important things from looking at this head gasket. So here's our obvious break, okay? Like, you just can't miss that. These 2 cylinders were sharing fire, so neither of them were functioning. But now here's what I find is interesting on this gasket. Okay, so look at the firing on the number 1 cylinder, and it's nice, it's intact. You see a clean line all the way around. Okay. Look at the space, or look at the gasket between cylinders number 1 and number 2, and look how nice that is. Okay. Now look at the gasket between cylinders 2 and number 3, and you see it's dark here. All right. So you see the difference between there and there and there and there. And we got to our obvious break, and now we go between cylinders 4 and 5, and we see the same darkness that we see over here. But now when we go between cylinders 5 and 6, it's clean again. Okay? So what this is saying to me is that this head is lifting in the middle. Okay, it's getting light in the middle. Now, it wasn't like a one-time overheat that did this, because if it was, you'd find those head bolts loose. But like I says, 1 and 2, nice. 3 and 4, or 2 and 3, I should say, dirty. 3 and 4, blown out. 4 and 5, dirty. 5 and 6, nice and clean again. So this head is lifting in the center. And these cylinders were on the verge. They were sharing, not so much sharing fire, but there was definitely leakage between these two cylinders at certain times, under certain circumstances. So right away now, this is telling me that there's going to be a warpage problem. Now, the warpage problem isn't always going to show itself when the parts are cold, because sometimes the part relaxes, or I should say it's relaxed when it's cold, and it'll check level. Now, when you heat it up, you get it up to operating temperature, or sometimes just over operating temperature. So in other words, not to a point of like really overheating, but hotter than usual. It'll distort. Now, that brings us to the next step, the block and the head. Now, obviously you want to check both for straightness, you want to check both for flatness. The block is usually not the problem. The block is usually, because when a block distorts to that point, it'll have many other symptoms. Because when it distorts at the deck, it's distorting around the cylinder walls. So you'll have a lot of signs of burning oil or weird scuff marks on the cylinder walls. And when we look over the cylinder walls in this engine, we don't see anything like that. We know that the block is not distorting excessively. But when we look at the head, we see that there's a lot of very unevenness to this head. Now, I did lay a straight edge across it. Well, okay, wait. Getting ahead of myself. Before you lay a straight edge across it, you got to clean it. Okay. Now, you watch videos of guys doing, cleaning up gaskets and stuff like that, and they'll use one of them cookies or an air dump, clean up. Do not do that. Don't do that. Okay, I know it's fast, but you're not a shop, right? You're not trying to break speed records, right? Don't do that. Try to use as few power tools on these things as possible. The reason being is that if you're not careful, if you're not experienced and you're not careful, you can, real quick, it happens real quick, you can dig divots and valleys into the deck surface, right? Don't do it. If you've got a gasket, if you've got gasket material, it's really stuck to either the deck of the block or the cylinder head, use a MAP gas torch and heat that stuff up. After you've got it hot, let's say you get it to like blow a little bit, you can just take a razor blade at that point and just like zook it right off. Avoid using any type of air or power tools when you're doing this stuff. If you have to, go ahead and do it. It's part of, you're working at a shop, you're working for a guy or whatever, and it says, yeah, do it this way. Well, you got no choice. If you're working on your stuff at home, yourself, take your time. Take your time. No rush here. Okay? All right. So our first step was we clean the head. Oops. Clean the head with a razor blade. Just got the heavy stuff off of it. Then, just like doing body work. All right. Now I should have used emery cloth, but I don't have any emery cloth here, so I used some 400 grit sandpaper and a board, and we just evenly clean the head as much as we could. All right. The idea here isn't to get the head perfect. The idea is to find the high and the low spots. Exactly the same as if you're doing body work, right? You get the block sanding the body, and you're not trying to make it perfect at first. You're trying to find just the high and the low spots so you know what needs work. When you sand the surface of the head, that's what you're looking for. You just want to get it so that if you go across and you go from one end of the head to the other, you can see all of the high and low spots fairly evenly. You're not trying to eliminate them, you're only trying to see them so you can read what's going on. So what we found here is we have some low spots But now here's a really bad one, okay? And we barely see a low spot here, right? So the low spot would be whatever's dark, obviously, right? Around this water passage, we have some real dark. So this is moving around right here, or I should say it's drawing back. The surface of the deck is drawing back. And you see a similar, but not quite as bad pattern here. You see it here, and not so bad here. So the middle of this head is a little cattywampus, all right? Now, the damage I'm seeing there in and of itself isn't really enough for me to say, okay, this head needs to be surfaced. But when I look at the machining that was done to this head, it's terrible. I mean, it's legitimately terrible. It's amongst the worst that I've ever seen from a factory engine. So when they originally surfaced this head, you know, it's a circular cutter, okay? And you see these lines here. This is just absolutely horrible. And when you run your hands over, you run your finger over this, you can actually feel these zebra stripes. I mean, these are deep. These are very deep. And they're not even through the head. Okay? All different patterns that we're seeing as we look over this head. Now remember, as long as you can see shiny parts, as long as it's shiny from one end to the other, we know that we're looking legitimately at the high and low spots of this head. And look at all of the different contours that we have here. These are the footprints left over from the original surfacing of this head. And it's horrible. I mean, literally horrible. It even has, I did not do this taking this apart. It even has marks on it, like where it was like dropped down on something, and you can feel them right there. Okay. That head needs to be sent to a machine shop and surfaced. Forget about cleaning it any further. Forget about trying to surface it yourself any further. At this point, that head needs to be sent out and cleaned. Now or surface, I should say. Now I did run a straight edge across it. So if I didn't see as much visual damage as I do with this machining, running the straight edge over it and checking for light would have been sufficient for me to say, okay, if it's flat here, we're just going to put it back on, right? But this is, to me, in my mind, this is a wasted step at this point because I see how bad the machining is. So I'm suspecting that head is slightly warped when I say slightly warped, a couple thousandths of an inch, thousandths to an inch. Really, it's not going to be very consequential. That head is only slightly warped when it's cold or at room temperature, but when you get it hot, it wants to distort a little bit, and it's trying to pull up in that center area, because that's where we're seeing our damage. Our main damage is right there, dead center of the engine, and then moderate damage, no damage, and when we look at the surface of the head, we don't see any patterns that mimic that. Okay? So it's telling me whatever I check on this head when it's cold is not going to be the same as this head when it's heated and being stressed. So we'll send it out to be surfaced, and we'll put it back together again. We're going to check the same thing on the block. Now here's an important thing. This is an important thing to realize about whenever you've got a head gasket that's blown like this. So let's say you were driving the engine, you know what the circumstance was. You were going up a hill, it started to ping, and all of a sudden it dropped 2 cylinders, right? And then, or you just limped it home. You went another 20, 50, 100 miles home. You know what? You're probably going to be just fine. But when you pick up an engine like this, where you have no idea what the history is, this thing could have been driven on those 4 cylinders for days, weeks, months, years, because it runs. I mean, I drove this truck. It's okay. It's way down on power. But it could have been driven for an indeterminate amount of time with fire being shared between those two cylinders. So this is what you have to realize about this. Even though the cylinders had no compression, they were still getting fuel, they were still getting spark, and the pistons were still pushing the fire around, okay? So now think about this. You've got a torch. Even though that cylinder is not making power, it doesn't have any compression, so it's not going to make any power, it's still making fire. And the piston is still pushing that fire up and out the exhaust, right? At the same time, it's pushing that fire through the gap. So you create a blowtorch, which is anytime you pull an engine apart, you find a break between the cylinders like we have on this one, you need to examine the deck surface and the cylinder head surface to make sure that there's no torching, right? So now I've already done that. So I checked it on the block and I checked it on this. So evidently this engine was pulled out of service not too long after it dropped those two cylinders. So damage wasn't done. But I have pulled apart many engines over the years that had two cylinders, next to each other with a blown head gasket, and the deck is torched out. The head is torched out. Aluminum heads are especially susceptible to this. So keep that in mind, and if that's the case, it depends how deep it is. You can cut the head far enough to get that damage out. If it happens on the deck, you're done, okay? That motor's got to come out, it's got to come apart, and the surface has to be done on it. So keep that in mind anytime you're chasing a blown gasket between two cylinders. All right, so Monday morning, I'll drop this thing over at the machine shop. When any luck, I get it back in a day or two, and I can slam this thing back together again. I now, as far as I talked about some unevenness in compression on those other cylinders, 1 and 2. I also did check 5 and 6 afterwards, and they're fine. They were all in that 150 PSI range. Number 1 was the only slightly low one. So I'm not sure if I want to actually invest in this engine and go through the whole process of pulling the pistons out of it, re-ringing it, bearings and all that stuff. And I decided not to do that. What I'm going to do with this engine is just put it back together again, get it running, run this Jeep around a little bit with a load on it just so I make sure it handles okay, and then I'm going to build a stroker for it. Because I know it's going to need more power. I know it's going to need more torque. So I'm going to end up doing a stroker with that other 4-liter block that we have. I don't know exactly when I'm going to do it. It's not like a critical thing. To me, the critical thing is to actually get this running, put a trailer behind it with a car, and run it out, 50, 100 miles and back in all different conditions, and make sure that I really like this idea before I commit any further to it. And this engine will be fine to just keep around as a spare. All right, so that's it. I hope you got something. I hope I covered all the bases. That's the thing, right? You shoot these videos. I should do a script, right? I should write some kind of script so I will make bullet points so I remember each of the things to talk about. But you know what? I don't do that. I just shoot these things off the top of my head. Idiot, right? I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.